Starting with the breaking news at this hour, PLA troops have violated the previous consensus arrived at during diplomatic engagements between India and China. The Ministry of Defence is informed. The statement said, and I quote, "On the night of 29th and 30th August 2020, PLA troops violated the previous consensus arrived at during military and diplomatic engagements during the ongoing standoff in eastern Ladakh and carried out provocative military movements to change the status quo." This comes as another major flare-up in Ladakh. Indian troops thwarted the PLA activity on the southern bank of Pangong Tso Lake. A brigade commander level flag meeting is in progress to resolve this issue. Indian and Chinese troops have been engaged in a bitter standoff in several areas along the line of actual control. The formal process of disengagement of troops began on July 6th. For more on this, we are now being joined by our correspondent Siddhant Sibal. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us. What is the latest on this?
Well, the situation remains precarious at the line of actual control, and the fact that the Indian side has confirmed the second violent face-off between both the sides shows that how ties between New Delhi and Beijing has deteriorated in past few months. In fact, what the statement talks about is that the incident happened in the southern bank of Pangong Lake. Well, this is very important given the fact that while the disengagement process was on, there were areas where there were issues, especially when it comes to Pangong Lake. Well, from finger 4 till finger 8 of Pangong Lake, the Chinese side had consolidated their positions. They weren't willing to leave, and that remained the bone of contention for the Indian side. The Indian side repeatedly asking the Chinese side to vacate that area. And the Indian side somewhere believed that the Chinese side might try to do what they did in the month of June, the Galwan incident. And the Indian side, of course, has now confirmed that they thwarted the Chinese intention of unilaterally changing the situation on the ground. But nonetheless, it looks like a long haul, and it is now confirmed that officially it can be said that Beijing-New Delhi relationship has gone a very, very negative territory.
All right, so then please stay with us. Right now we're joined by Atul Aneja, China correspondent for The Hindu. He's live with us from New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to begin by asking you, what do you make of these recent developments and escalation at the border at this point?
Well, it just shows that it's an indication of Chinese intention that they are not, that we are in for a long haul with them, and they are not in a mood to disengage from the border. I mean, yesterday's or 29th August incident just proves that beyond any doubt that this is going to be a very long haul. And specifically to the border, they've also shown that Pangong Tso Lake area is the one in which they'll be least willing to disengage. So I think we are in for a very, very long haul here. And it will require not only effort from the military, but from the diplomatic side. But I think beyond the army, what we might have to do is also go along the waters of the Andaman Sea and Malacca Straits and put pressure on China from that end as well. In fact, what the Chinese have been indicating is the possibility of a two-front war, that is with them and the Pakistanis. But I think the counter to that would be again a two-front opening, one from the Indian side in Ladakh, and the other would be from the waters of the Indian Ocean and the West Pacific.
I'm going to come back to this point that you're making. Right now we're being joined by Swaran Singh, Professor of School of International Studies of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to pose the same question to you. What do you make of the current situation and the escalation at the border at this point?
Chinese have been insisting on equal and mutual disengagement, which is not acceptable to India because it is the Chinese who have come forward from their position of actual control. So in that sense, Chinese are ratcheting up these things to create pressure for negotiations. What we know in public knowledge is that from July 14th onwards, the disengagement Corps commanders negotiations had almost hit a wall from there. And of course, initially after 15th June, what happened in Galwan, they had kind of successfully done certain amount of disengagement both in Hot Springs and in Galwan Valley. But we are also, hearing in public that Chinese have been kind of denying certain access to the usual space where Indian patrolling used to happen in They've sunk planes also. This is a new point which they have kind of created here in south of Pangong Lake, because north of Pangong Lake was where we were seeing disruptions happening over a period of time in last 4 months or so. So as Atul was just now saying, I think both sides are reinforcing, ratcheting up and trying to influence negotiations in pushing their own version of what they wish to achieve in those negotiations.
All right.
But it sort of, it defies any logic, the fact that Chinese want equal and mutual disengagement, that both sides should be moving backwards from their currently held positions, because it is for the Chinese to move backwards because they move forward first. So in that sense, it's a kind of unacceptable demand, and that is why negotiations, as I believe, have perhaps come to almost a halt. But this is part of sort of force projections, which is constantly ratcheting up situations. And Chinese are beginning to be known for last 4 or 5 months now to creating new points of contention which never existed before. So some points were known, about half a dozen points were known as areas where sort of confusion could lead to encounters. But now Chinese are, repeated now coming out with new points of disruption and confusion. And that is fundamentally to, bully Indian negotiators to see that, we should accept what they want us to sort of achieve in terms of how disengagement should happen. But I don't think that is going to happen, because as Atul just mentioned, we have other levers. We have levers across Tri-Services Command in Andaman Nicobar. We are sending Navy to South China Sea. So there are multiple other levers that India has. And I think these will be a bit of a long-drawn negotiations. Earlier, it used to be long-drawn negotiations between diplomats, but are we seeing now even Corps Commander level on the border? Negotiations, 5 rounds of Corps Commanders have happened, for example, already. Some of that perhaps will linger on for a longer period of time.
Okay, I would just like to bring back Atul Aneja once again. Sir, I would like to go back to the point that you were making about China's intentions. Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, you see that the mindset of the Chinese, and what Swaran was mentioning, which is evident in the last 4 or 5 months, to me, Xi Jinping's mindset is the Middle Kingdom mindset. Okay. There was a period when we had Deng Xiaoping coming in, and they were willing to engage the world in a much more conciliatory way. But I do see that the later Xi Jinping doctrine is really a Middle Kingdom where China remains the center of the world and others have to align with it or link with it as tributary states. It's that traditional mindset of the Chinese empire, which can be traced to 1000 BC, which has once again resurfaced. And that's why you see this level of belligerence which is coming. And it's the mentality of the current Chinese leadership, especially after COVID-19. So therefore, that kind of mindset is there also reflected in the Ladakh area, where they are showing no room for flexibility. And I don't think they're going to, unless there is a counter pressure which is built. Now, the point is, where do you build the counter pressure? Do you build it in the mountains in Ladakh, or do you build it elsewhere? And do you build it diplomatically? I have never been a great fan of the Quad earlier, but in the current circumstances, I see no option how to impose pressure on the Chinese, especially in South China Sea, unless we have a partnership or an understanding with the Quad to put that pressure with the Americans, with the Japanese, and us in it, so that we mount that kind of diplomatic and military pressure on the other flank and not just on this. But the bottom line is, this is not going to happen anytime soon. We are in for a very long haul. And I think Indians, not just the Indian establishment, but the Indian people have to be prepared. It may not be just months, but it may be years before we are finally over this crisis in a very fundamental way.
Okay, we would like to go back to Siddhant now. And Siddhant, I want to ask you, let's just take a step back for a minute and go over the events that sparked the standoff in the first place in the Galwan Valley, and now what has caused this flare-up again. So can you explain that to us once, just for the viewers?
Well, it is primarily the mentality, the Chinese mentality. Perhaps they are looking forward to COVID as an opportunity where they can assert themselves. And it's just not with India, it is with other neighbors as well, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Japan over Senkaku Island. In fact, Australia as well when it comes to trade issues. So multiple level we have seen how the Chinese have been assertive or aggressive, to use the word, to use the phrase. And if you look at when it comes to New Delhi, well, New Delhi has been trying to make sure that the Chinese change their way. There have been conversations happening both at the diplomatic level, at the military level, number of rounds of conversation. But many were saying here in India that these talks are fruitless when we are dealing with China. And the incident, the second violent face-off, has confirmed that talks have been largely fruitless, given the fact that the Chinese again tried to unilaterally change the situation. In June, it was Galwan Valley. Now, of course, in August, it is the Pangong Lake, where we know that already the situation was not very good. And next 2 weeks will be very important in terms of diplomatic engagement, because we know the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings, the defense ministers meeting and the foreign ministers meeting will be taking place in Russia. The Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh has confirmed that he will be going.
All right, let's just go back to Professor Swaran Singh. Now, I want to ask you, a brigade commander level flag meeting is in place. Now, what is that going to entail, and what could that mean? What could we expect from these meetings?
I think these meetings are very likely to continue. That's, I think, itself fairly encouraging that at various levels. And there is an enormous personal chemistry. We have a foreign minister who's a career diplomat and therefore on first name basis with several Chinese in the leadership. So, he was also ambassador there. We have also a very, very comfortable chemistry between two special representatives. Talks on the border are happening. But it's fundamentally the shift, I would say, from Chapter 1, which was focusing from 1988 on ensuring peace and tranquility. Both sides were, sort of growing in terms of their overall stature since 1988. It is time, after Xi Jinping took over power in China, that perhaps the relationship is moving to Chapter 2 of how the equations will be built. Chinese have been insistent that India should recognize the asymmetry of the relationship. And I think that is where India is now, showing that India can stand up to China. And indeed, let me say, the entire periphery of China, which is facing this kind of an angst and anxiety of China's assertiveness, is looking at India's response to China very carefully. And ASEAN potentially could also be a group of countries which could stand up, because individually they have not been able to stand up to what Chinese are doing in South China Sea. And now Indian Navy's presence, American Navy's presence in South China Sea will perhaps also encourage the rest of the periphery. We are seeing Vietnam, Japan and other countries also becoming vocal about it. So I agree with Atul. It's going to be long drawn. It's going to be continuing over a period of time, because it's redefining the relationship. We are recasting the relationship entirely with China. And it would take certain time for both sides to get used to where is the equilibrium they wish to achieve between the two sides. So some of that disruption perhaps will continue, but I also have a clear confidence that 15th of June in Galwan was an aberration even for the Chinese. I don't think Chinese either can afford or ever wanted to have that kind of skirmish happening. Indian side has repeatedly underlined the fact, starting from the foreign minister, that this is the worst case of incidents to happen in last 45 years on the border, which means we have not been able to manage on both sides these things with lower casualties or lower costs than what we received on 15th of June. Chinese are completely silenced. I would love to see on 30th of September, the Chinese called that day as Martyrs' Day. And in 2014, President Xi Jinping was the one who anointed that day every year, 30th of September, as Martyrs' Day. So let us see if Chinese are willing to say something about martyrdom of people on their side on the border on 15th of June. So, they could also be facing their own internal pressures. We are noticing that certain WIPO, posts have talked about a particular tombstone in Galwan. So all kinds of internal pressures China is facing, also increasingly external pressures. We are seeing India, as Atul was mentioning, getting really inching closer to Quad. That is partly because it is becoming inclusive. By now, Americans are talking of Quad Plus. South Korea, Vietnam and New Zealand are added to the 4 countries, India, Japan, Australia, United States. Malabar exercises will now have Australia, which India was reluctant for a long time. India has moved up, to the ministerial level negotiations in Quad. So I think there is going to be this upsurge or groundswell of several countries coming together. And I think India would be a kind of a major player because we are immediately facing the fire on the border, given our disputed border. So how India behaves is important, and India clearly is sending the message that India is ready to stand up to Chinese, and Chinese bullying is not going to work against India.
That's actually what I'm going to talk about next. Atul, I would like to ask you, now I'm going to go back to a statement made by the Defence Ministry. As per a statement, they said that Indian troops preempted this PLA activity and undertook the measures to strengthen these measures. So what do you make of this statement? How do you assess this?
No, this is exactly what Soren was saying. This means we are standing up to the Chinese. We did it in Galwan, and we did it here in Pangong Tso. So the message is loud and clear, not only for our domestic audience, but to our audience, which is carefully watching us, especially in ASEAN and Southeast Asia. So that's one. Military statement gives that signal that there is no way that we are going to relent on this. Maybe the Chinese were testing us out, and that message goes to the Chinese as well.
All right.
That it's not going to be something that we are going to relent on. I want to make one additional point. While I did speak about the need to strengthen the Quad on our eastern flank, I think we need also to strengthen our Eurasian flank. And I think our relationship with Russia is going to be extremely important. Soren talked about the SCO meeting, Rajnath Singh going there. And so the Russian flank needs to be activated because Russians have traditionally had a problem with the Chinese, though presently they say they have a strategic relationship. But even recently, the Chinese have questioned the inclusion of Vladivostok as part of Russia. And this has been the latest friction which has caused, probably because the Russians have decided to sell us MiG-29s and Sukhoi 30, additional quantities of that after Rajnath Singh's earlier visit.
All right.
So I think we need to activate the Russian flank simultaneously as we do the Quad in Southeast Asian countries. I think unless we have a pincer of pressure on Chinese, I don't see how diplomacy and dialogue, despite the personal chemistry, which is very important, is really going to yield results. So it's going to be, I think, a Herculean and a multi-pronged effort requiring all instruments of power, from diplomacy to military and multi-flank approach, which I think finally is likely to make China bend. Otherwise, I don't see in the current mindset they being succumbing to any reasonable argument.
Yes, also the Defence Ministry statement also asserted that the army is committed to maintaining peace and tranquility through dialogue, but is also equally determined to protect its territorial integrity. Now, how do you assess that? What could this mean for the relations between the two countries going forward in the coming weeks?
Coming week, I think we got to be prepared for the long haul. We need to go and exercise patience and be on complete alert, because what's happening is that there is a great game between India and China being played in the neighborhood. It is playing out in Nepal, it's playing out in Bangladesh, it's playing out in Sri Lanka. So we have to be vigilant of Chinese activities from Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Maldives, and make sure that we are not in a situation of disadvantage in our neighborhood areas, because that's another flank which the Chinese have opened up, which we have seen.
All right. Professor Soren, coming back to you now, can the fact that China would engage in such activities at a time when a world is battling a global pandemic be seen as a coincidence, or do you think they're using this as an opportunity?
I think they are clearly using this as an opportunity because they believe that they have come out of COVID-19 when the rest of the world is still struggling and sinking into it. And also they believe that since the core of their strength is economic power, their factories are churning materials and they're going around the world to sell things again. But they don't perhaps appreciate as much that if the global demand is sinking, then their export-driven economy will also not be able to show that resilience that they think they will be able to do. For the first time after 17 years, this year's government work report did not make any mention of the target of growth rate, because Chinese think they will be growing faster than how World Bank and IMF are calculating. So I think this is the sense of looking at this as an opportune time to pursue the strategies or the policies that China always wanted. I mean, they have talked about century of humiliation, that so many imperial treaties did wrong to China. They want to reclaim those territories. They want to reassert themselves again. And now they think it's an opportune time. But I think it's a miscalculation, because both internally there are questions being asked, and externally people are now coming up and saying, let us coordinate to deal with this kind of bullying behavior of China. The wolf warrior diplomacy has really upset emotionally people are hurt the way they've been addressed by Chinese ambassadors in various places. So I think this is actually creating a groundswell where several nations are going to come together. And I'm not talking here necessarily United States, that's taking its war against China very separately, but the middle powers of Asia Pacific, Japan, Australia, India, Vietnam, South Korea, New Zealand, these are the countries which are increasingly feeling that sense of skepticism of whether should they be engaging and trusting Chinese, or should they be really trying to come together and countervail and put restraints on Chinese behavior. And my sense is that this will begin to show up very clearly in formal initiatives. I mentioned how Japan has started a triangular India, Japan, Australia supply chain resilience initiative last week. They are expecting the trade ministers to meet next month to begin to debate of how decoupling has to be pursued, where Chinese, are going to be no longer the desired place for several international multinational companies or to have their production centers in China. They want to move out to other places. So in that sense, I think there is a growing sense. And India's case in Galwan and in Pangong Lake is a microcosm, is a kind of a trigger to that how Chinese are behaving against their largest neighbor, India, which was clearly following a policy of what we call engagement with China. Enormous economic engagement of trade and investment had happened over a period of time. Prime Minister had started informal summits with President Xi Jinping, trying to sort of recast a relationship in a very positive, constructive fashion to mold regional and global affairs and initiatives. To now this ratcheting up, I think Chinese are looking at this as an opportunity to sort of push things as much as they can, because they think they are having the leverages now, whereas others do not have those leverages because they are engaged with COVID-19 pandemic internally. And that, I think, is giving an enormous sense of any country which tries to hit another neighbor when neighbor is already facing another challenge, creates a sentiment which is long lasting. And I think that kind of sentiment across the periphery is going to see that the periphery will come together increasingly, not necessarily led by United States, but on their own. I think they will be coming together and coordinating their own initiatives to ensure that they can together help each other in achieving that resilience in their economic growth rates. And I think that is how these countries are beginning to look at India as a leader in that position, where we are facing the Chinese directly, and how we negotiate, how we overall build a bigger strategy in conducting our state of affairs vis-a-vis Chinese. And this will have layers and layers of several parts of that strategy. I keep mentioning the increasing visibility of Lobsang Sangay, the Chinese, the Tibetan government in exile head. And that kind of leverages how we are engaging Taiwan over a period of time, how we are engaging other countries, Vietnam, Mongolia, and others. So I think it's a larger web which has to be built. But at the same time, I'm sure Indian side is also aware how Chinese are reinforcing their side of line of actual control. Additional troops are being brought in on their side. Additional facilities are being built. Both anti-air missile stations are being built. New tarmacs are being sort of refurbished so that they can deploy quickly their air power there. So internal reinforcement of China perhaps also should be the concern for Indian side to sort of build that strategy, and reinforcement on the Indian side should also happen. India is talking already, for example, of buying automated underwater these vessels which Navy will use to sort of go across around Malacca Straits, other places. Our vigil on Malacca Strait has increased. So it's I think a large network of initiatives that India will have to be part of, and take initiative in those to make sure that fundamentally these are two large growing nations and their equations are important. And these equations are not just limited to one particular border point that can be a trigger, but response is really wider and deeper in that sense. And I think that is already being built, where India is becoming far more acceptable to countries in the periphery than China is. And I think that is our advantage. The fact that the whole world is angry with China is our advantage, and that maximizes our leverages in dealing with China. But of course, the bottom line is that India doesn't want war. India wants to ensure peace and tranquility, because that is what serves India's national interest best. And we are communicating that constantly. But this bullying behavior, I think, is going to be not acceptable. And that message is going very clearly to the Chinese.
All right. When you talk about internal reinforcement from China, could you elaborate on that? How could that affect the ongoing standoff? It's
to some extent, since there is a tension on the border, such reinforcements are happening on both sides. But let's say that because Chinese over last 40 years have built their internal infrastructure relatively better, and I think India is also in the process of building that infrastructure, and indeed that is where the problem began. The fact that we were building a road through Galwan Valley, reaching to Daulat Beg Oldie Tarmac airfield, which would connect Leh and that airfield very, very quickly in about 6 hours, is what Chinese felt rattled, and they fully understand what that kind of road means in terms of power equations or bringing troops forward quickly, and that airfield is very strategic because both Aksai Chin, Siachen, Karakoram Highway and the other expressway between Lhasa and Xinjiang, they all come into that within theater where this airfield will have enormous strategic influence. So Chinese understand what infrastructure can bring about in maximizing the power projections on either side, and they have built that power projection the base of infrastructure over the last 40 years, and therefore they can bring forward their forces relatively much faster, and that's what they're doing. They have reinforced, bringing more forces closer to the LAC. They are kind of refurbishing some of these tarmacs. They are kind of creating new, air defense stations kind of thing near Mansarovar Lake. I was reading in one of the reports. So the reinforcement that China is doing indicate that they are not looking at it as an equation that is going to be resolved in a hurry. They are looking at it as something which will continue over a period of time. And it's a typical Chinese strategy, is 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, which is happening all across. They are trying to now open multiple fronts simultaneously because they have that capability to bring forces forward much faster. So that kind of Chinese showcasing and of course bullying on the border is going on, and that will continue over a period of time. And if we are able to read their enforcements behind the line of actual control, that will perhaps give us some idea on both how to reinforce on our side, but also how to look at negotiations as to how long these negotiations are likely to continue. And I agree with Atul, these are going to be long-drawn negotiations and reinforcements are going to continue. So even at the national level, I mean, we will have to understand, because multiple elections in India, we will possibly see that some of these issues will come in public debate. So Indian constituencies, in terms of popular constituencies of our leaders, will also have to be prepared to fully sensitize themselves of this entirely kind of a strange, adventurous bully behavior of China, yes, given the fact that they think they're sort of out of COVID-19 and they want to push things as faster as they can. And I think it's going to be long drawn, and therefore we have to be prepared for a long drawn continuing negotiations on the border, reinforcements, global networking. And India is becoming a kind of a desirable sort of country for others to engage us. And they want India to be part of that global regional network of putting restraints on China. The way India was supported, for example, for 8th time going as a non-permanent member of UN Security Council. We are going there from January, so we'll be sitting along with Chinese representatives there, even if we are not the permanent member. India is not a permanent member as of now. But 183 countries in a secret ballot supported India out of 193. That shows that our campaign to go there and sit in Security Council saw a certain positive response. So there is a positive response to India. And I think India negotiating or dealing with China would be seen as a frontline player in that sense, where the rest of the countries want to come together and work certain amount of restraint on China, particularly now ASEAN nations, which were completely silent on China taking over virtually much of the South China Sea. But now we are noticing that kind of consensus voices beginning to sort of reveal themselves even in the collective ASEAN. And we will hear likewise voices in other countries in the periphery also. And India, because India is the largest country, India is the largest neighbor, largest economy in the neighborhood of China, I think will wield a certain amount of influence in those kind of initiatives to put restraints on China. And United States, of course, is also growing in terms of its interest in India, its proximity with India. And United States, always I say, comes with a package deal of about 24 other friends and allies who also then become close to India, from Saudi Arabia to Philippines to New Zealand. So in that sense, I think it's a new kind of a diplomacy-driven initiative, which will see India recasting equations with China and sending the message that bullying behavior will not really pay them in the long run. And I think that message is already going to them, but I think they are taking time to understand, and they are repeatedly falling back to same position of bullying, ratcheting up. And I think that is something which is reflects in Chinese behavior. but they better understand India's message. And I think that is the message that will ultimately set the new equations, that it's going to be mutual respect, peace and tranquility on the border, and negotiating the border in resolving it, and not trying to bully around with other countries in the neighborhood, particularly India.
Let's just
he has repeatedly showcased.
Sorry to cut you off, but let's just go across to Atul and Nija now. I want to ask you, could you maybe shine some light on the economic fallout of these worsening relations?
Well, the economic fallout is very, very tangible. We already know that certain Chinese apps have been banned, but that itself is indication that there is the beginning of a decoupling, which has already started in the field of technology. And I think this process is only going to accelerate in the future. Trade will continue to a basic level. There is one area of dependence, I think, which India has on China, which is on your APIs, which are used for the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. I think that's one critical, I would say that's a leverage which China has on us, and sooner we resolve that, the better it is. While this decoupling process takes place here, I think it's very important to look at the geo-economic side. What Swaran had mentioned of a new supply chain being developed between Japan, Australia, India. But I think we need to accelerate that process on the geo-economic plane of building new supply chains in all domains, which compensate for the loss which is going to happen with the Chinese. I think this is very important to give the Chinese a message that the continuation of their behavior right now is going to have major repercussions for them. But it's going to be a slow process, but it's going to require deep strategizing from our side. And a partnership has to be created with what is called the democracies and other partner countries. I think that process must begin as soon as possible. And overall, when we look at China, we are looking at the geopolitical plane, of which we have already discussed. There is a geo-economic plane which has come in, and there is a third plane which is preparing our own population for the long haul. And if I may say, that we have to give very clear indication to China what will resolve this resolve this issue. I think we have already stated that we need to maintain the status quo ante on the border. That's number one. General Rawat has recently reinforced that. Second, I think it's time that China is communicating the message that normalization of India will depend when China stops obstructing India's rise, which means India's membership to the UN Security Council, NSG. This must come through as a clear-cut message. And I think unless China respects us also on the geoculture plane, there is a Confucian civilization associated with China, and you can see that influence. But there is also Indian civilization's cultural influence, which you see from here right up to Southeast Asia and in Central Asia and to West Asia as well. The Chinese must be willing to accept India as an equal civilizational state. I think these are certain benchmarks which we need to keep in mind. And that normalization of ties with China will depend on complete equality and complete mutual respect for the two civilizations. And unless that happens, I see this frankly as an opportunity. When you have phases of disruption like this means that you can recast the die. And that's the situation where we are. And there are tremendous opportunities in the long run, medium and long term, which we see. But the main thing is that we have to remain clear-headed and steadfast. I think one very important thing which has happened is, I think it's clarified our mind vis-a-vis China. I mean, we were in the process of engagement with China. Swaran mentioned it, Chennai summit, Wuhan, the principles coming together. But I think what this incident or this Galwan incident, what's happened there on 29th, 30th, I think it's made it very clear that, this policy of a dual engagement right now is not really working. And we got to go back to the drawing room. There was a mention of 1988, Rajiv Gandhi's visit. I think we got to go back to a pre-1988 era and not just pre-1993. And look at the India-China relationship completely new and from the drawing board and build it up from there. And I think this is the opportunity which has come to us now. It is also requires a great skill, thought, steadfastness, and strength of national character. But I think this opportunity should not be wasted. And as we start negotiating our negotiations with the Chinese on the military and other front, I think this broader vision we need to keep in mind and go till we are fully satisfied that this is a complete relationship of equality and mutual respect. I think that will be the bottom line, and we need not compromise in the short run and then kick the can downwards and have another problem coming up because of the asymmetrical relationship which we have with China right now.
Okay, going back to the high-level diplomatic talks, a deadlock, when we talk about a deadlock over parts of Ladakh where the Chinese army set up camp earlier this year, not much has been resolved despite 5 rounds of talks between the militaries of both nations. What could be the reasons for that?
Well, I think from a Chinese perspective, what they have in mind is that since we have built this road about which Swaran was mentioning, the road to DBO, I think they feel vulnerable about Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin is a territory of great strategic significance for the Chinese because it is that territory which links up Tibet with Xinjiang. So for the Belt and Road Initiative, for various other reasons, this linkage is very important. So Aksai Chin is of extreme strategic importance to them. And I think there may be apprehension that with the coming of the road, there is this soft underbelly of China which gets exposed. So I think that could be one of the reasons why, apart from the attitudinal and the mindset which the Chinese have, is something which they're worried about. But if they are worried about Aksai Chin, then that's something you need to talk about. And you talk it not between corps commanders and others, a dialogue which is absolutely necessary. But that's where you come in with the border dialogue, which has to come, the boundary issue dialogue, which is taking place between the special representatives, who I agree with Swaran have extremely good personal chemistry, at least as of now. So we need now to step up from the tactical talks which are taking place at the border in Ladakh to strategic border boundary talks which are going to come, where Chinese can bring up the Aksai Chin issue, we bring up our own issues, but we have to go ahead and completely resolve this border. This particular formulation, which starts from 1988, that we will delink the boundary question from the economic equation, that economic engagement will continue while we have just confidence-building measures going on along the border, that's over. From now onwards, if we want to reset our relationship, it must be on the basis of complete resolution of the border. And till that happens, the economic engagement to the level it was going on or level it could have reached, that cannot continue. I think this delinking of the two needs to be stopped from now as we go ahead and further. At some point, we will negotiate. I'm sure we will negotiate. I think this has to be one of our main talking points.
All right. Now, I think it all really just boils down to this question that I'm going to ask you next. How dangerous can this ongoing standoff prove to be for both the sides?
Well, it can be very dangerous. But look, I think there are certain markers we've got to keep in mind. I think the biggest marker right now is the upcoming US elections. If Trump gets elected again, then this China containment or the Cold War policy, which we saw, actually I thought was inaugurated when Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the US, made his July 23rd speech in the Nixon Center, which was actually an announcement of a new Cold War, I think. But that will persist only, I think, if Trump gets administered. Though they say that there is a consensus in the American establishment, I don't think so. I think if Joe Biden comes to power, the Democrats, because and the downstream connections which they have within American society and businesses, are not going to be as hardline towards the Chinese as the Trump administration. So I think Chinese are looking at that marker, that what happens in the US elections. Till that time, I think we are in a state of flux. I don't think they're going to go for all-out war, but the tensions will persist. But in case Trump comes to power, I think then the equation changes. Then you have this particular defense line starting from Ladakh down to South China Sea. I think that gets reinforced and will deter Chinese to them. So I think the most dangerous phase in a way is coming between now and the elections in the United States. And we also have a certain change in leadership in Japan. I think that the Chinese have noticed this very clearly, the departure of Shinzo Abe. So there will be some transition in Japan. If we have a leader as clear and strong a China as Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So I think that, again, the Chinese. So we got to see these changes which are taking place. There's a third element which is taking place, and that is at a popular element. This is what I call this click T alliance at the popular level, which has started from Hong Kong, goes on to Taiwan, and now also includes young people in Thailand, which has gone beyond Twitter campaign and internet campaign, physically on the ground.
All right.
So there's a popular level of protests also which the Chinese will factor in. I think these are the broad themes which the Chinese will take in before coming to a decision on what happens.
Okay, sir, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to intervene. We are now being joined by Vishnu Prakash, who is a former Indian diplomat. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to get your perspective on what you make of these recent developments in escalation at the border.
Well, I'm not surprised at all. China has amassed its troops. They have been fortifying their positions. They have been developing infrastructure. I think we all know that we are in for the long haul, and they will constantly do that. They will probe our defenses. They will try to provoke, and then they will deny everything, because as Foreign Minister Wang Yi had the temerity to tell his American audience that China is a peace-loving country and it does not have one aggressive gene in its system. So that is typically Chinese behavior.
Okay, so I've asked this to Atul as well, and I would like to ask you now, the deadlock, when we talk about this deadlock over that we're stuck in now, why have we not been able to resolve this even after high-level military talks? Like, what is the reason that this hasn't worked out for us?
For the simple reason that China does not want it to be solved. Please, let's wind back a bit and see that after all discussions that we have had, China has never spoken of restoring status quo ante at the LAC. In fact, we would recall that when External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar on 17th June spoke to Mr. Wang Yi, Mr. Wang Yi in fact accused the Indian side of violently attacking the Chinese officers and asked for severe punishment. So this is standard China. They will do what they want to do and then they'll flatly deny. They have not amassed their troops for just going back. They want to send a message to India, to the neighbors and to the world that they are the hegemon, and they also want to try to cut India to size as they see it. They believe that India is punching above its weight, and they will do everything possible to keep India pinned down to South Asia. So this is a very well known fact about the Chinese behavior.
Okay, so I want to ask you now, when you talk about that you're not surprised that this has happened, why do you think that they would feel that this escalation or this flare-up again would be necessary at this point, especially when the world is dealing with a global pandemic?
Well, we can ask the same question, why did they wage the aggression in early May? Chinese motives are generally, it's difficult to fathom their motives, but could be a number of factors. India's growing stature, the fact that not today, but India can be a countervailing force to China in the coming years. I mean, China believes that in its mandate from heaven, genuinely believes it, that and in Chinese, China is called as Chu Gaku, or Middle Kingdom, that they are at the center of the universe, they are the hegemon, and others should be subservient to China. So, and that is why China has always been trying to give pinpricks to India via Pakistan on all issues of concern to us, and they will continue to do so because they are not comfortable with the rise of India and our growing our infrastructure which is improving along the border.
All right.
When they do it, it is right. When we do it, it is wrong. India's relationship with the USA, when they spoke of G2, when Obama visited in 2009, and they spoke of China and USA being the a factor of peace and stability in South Asia, it was right.
All right.
So basically, a hegemon will believe in what they do, what they say is right, what others say is wrong.
Okay, I would like to ask you, if the LAC is to start behaving like the LOC, what would be the strategic implications of this?
Well, the Chinese are not agreeable to anything. We have had 22 rounds of senior representatives dialogue. China has not moved an inch. In fact, they have now maintaining that it's an issue left by history. Let future generations solve it. While they have been engaging in salami slicing, or 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So it takes 2 to tango. But they are very comfortable in not having the LAC even delineated, forget demarcated. And if you recall, in 1993, when we had the Agreement of Peace and Tranquility, they refused to accept the formulation of present LAC. So Chinese designs are very clear. They do not respect or recognize McMahon Line, and they are eyeing large tracts of Indian territory.
All right, I would like to pose the same question to our other 2 guests as well, Swaran and Atul. What do you think will be the strategic consequences or implications if the LAC is to start behaving like the LOC? And what does that even mean, if you could just explain to begin with?
Okay, Atul.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Atul, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, let me take it. I think it's not likely to happen. LOAC is a very different kind of terrain, size, and we are dealing with a very different country than LOC here. On LOC, for 40 years, we have seen use of low-intensity conflict. We have seen use of terrorism as a sort of source of creating certain kind of trouble for India. Chinese are not going to use directly any such tactics against India on the border. That's first. So LOC and LAC will remain different entirely. But I think we will see increasing tensions. If you mean the measure of tensions on the border with LOC and LAC, yes, LAC will see more of tensions. We are now seeing an entire new era of not only increased frequency of encounters, we are also seeing encounters on multiple points simultaneously. We are seeing China ratcheting up new points of disruption which never existed before. So if you are measuring tensions on the border, then perhaps line of control and line of actual control with Pakistan and China respectively will perhaps begin to look coming closer, because LOC has seen relatively lowering of tensions because the management of terrorism in last about 1 year has been relatively better. We still have problems, but number of terrorists crossing and creating disruption is relatively less. Chinese side, we are seeing encounters happening more regularly at multiple places. So tensions would see them coming closer to each other, but not the genre of tactics that both sides apply. Chinese will apply very, very different tactics, and they will continue to only showcase, create rhetoric, create bullying behavior. But Chinese would never be willing to see a direct confrontation. It is not in their DNA. Neither, of course, India wants a direct war with China, but this kind of measuring up each other will constantly happen. And some of these slip-aways or this kind of aberrations that happened in Galwan on 15th of June may happen again. I hope they don't happen, but these are aberrations. Neither side actually wants things of that nature to happen on the border. But therefore, line of control and line of actual control will see very different kind of challenge to India, and our strategies likewise will have to be very, very different. With China, we have to,
that the Chinese will apply different
creating
tactics.
that restraint on China's behavior.
I'm sorry, I have to...
Economic instruments are being used. Just last 10 seconds, I'm just saying that I will see $10 billion of reduction in bilateral trade at end of this year. I will see also enormous amount of reduction in investments which are coming afresh, but also contracted investments will not be materializing this year. So there is a very clear, strong message going from India to the Chinese, because economics is their core strength, and if we hit on that, they will better understand our message.
Yes, I'm so sorry to intervene. We're actually running short of time. We'll just quickly go across to Vishnu for his perspective on this.
Well, I agree with Professor Swaran Singh, but the only additional point that I want to make is that for it, China is not agreeable, but for it to become a LOC, the boundary has to be delineated and demarcated. So we are a long way away from that. In fact, we don't even know where the boundary is. There is, even on a map, it has not been delineated. So I don't think that we are anyway close to converting into LOC, but the problems will still remain. The problems are not going to go away.
All right, I would like to thank all of our guests, Professor Swaran Singh, Atul Aneja and Vishnu Prakash. Thank you so much for joining us and for your perspective and inputs on this. We now have to slip into a short break. We will be back. News continues on WION. Do stay tuned.